In the centre of the city, hidden in the narrow alleys of old neighbourhoods, a new theatre had opened. No one knew who owned it, where it had come from, or why no one had heard of it until now. Its sign flickered with a dim, ominous light, and the posters promised something special. The Theatre of Nightmares. Your fears will become reality. The first performance gathered a large audience, drawn in by the mystery and the promise of thrills. On stage, stories were played out that were eerily familiar to each person sitting in the hall. They depicted moments from people's lives, fear of losing loved ones, nightmares about personal weaknesses, scenes of deep personal tragedies. Each episode ended in a horrifying climax, leaving the audience stunned and terrified. But the strangest part began afterward. Those whose stories were shown on stage encountered these same events in their lives a few days later. Rumours about the theatre spread quickly, and people began to fear even approaching it. They said that the building itself was cursed, that strange whispers and moans could be heard inside even when no performance was taking place. The theatre's windows glowed with a dim red light at night, and many claimed to have seen shadows moving on their own behind the locked doors. One of them, David, seemed particularly shaken. He described how scenes from his life were shown on stage that he couldn't have shared with anyone, scenes from his childhood that only he and his parents knew about. David looked devastated, as if his mind had suffered a wound that could never heal. A couple of days after visiting the theatre, David stopped responding to calls. Colleagues were worried, trying to reach him, but no one could find him. Michael went to his house and was horrified to discover that the doors and windows were wide open, as if something had burst out or, conversely, forced its way in. The air was filled with a faint smell of burning and something rotten, leaving a sense of hopelessness. Inside, chaos reigned. Furniture was overturned, photographs were scattered, and strange claw-like marks were visible on the walls. Another colleague, Sarah, also visited the theatre. She tried to convince everyone that it was just a coincidence, that everything happening was a result of stress and imagination. But a few days later she was seen wandering the street in her nightgown, barefoot, with a vacant stare, as if she was somewhere else entirely. She was taken to the hospital, and the doctors said she had experienced severe psychological trauma. Sarah couldn't speak. Her lips only moved, repeating the same words. They see me, they know. No one could understand who she meant. But the scariest story was that of his friend Tom. Tom came to work with a pale face, unable to concentrate, constantly looking around and flinching at every sound. He told Michael that he had seen himself in the future on the theatre stage, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by wires and machines, while darkness gathered outside the window, from which bony hands reached out. A week later, Tom was indeed hospitalized. He had a heart attack and the doctors couldn't explain the cause. Michael went to visit him and saw the expression of terror that wouldn't leave his friend's face even in his unconscious state. Tom whispered softly, "They'll come for you too, Michael. Don't go there." Succumbing to the growing fear, Michael decided to visit the theatre himself. Inside, a suffocating atmosphere reigned. The dim light of the lamps barely lit the hall, and the shadows seemed to have lives of their own. The walls were covered with tarnished mirrors, in which the reflections appeared distorted, sometimes entirely unfamiliar. It seemed as if the theatre was breathing, its walls pulsing in tune with the repressed fears of every spectator. Sitting in the dark hall, Michael realized with horror that the story of his life was playing out on stage. Scenes from his childhood, fears of losing his family, nightmares in which he fought for the lives of his loved ones. He saw an actor portraying himself with an expression of terror on his face that Michael felt deep in his own heart. At one point the actor turned and looked directly at him, and Michael was sure he saw his own eyes filled with fear and despair. Realizing that the upcoming event threatened his family, Michael rushed to the theatre director, trying to stop the performance. But his path was blocked by mysterious figures wearing antique masks. The masks were not just masks. They seemed alive, twisted faces covered in cracks from which black liquid oozed. Each step was met with a new obstacle, as if the stage itself had come to life to protect its secret. The floor beneath his feet began to move, turning into something viscous, like a swamp full of dark hands trying to grab his ankles. Michael now needed to uncover who or what controlled this theatre and find a way to break the chain of events to avoid becoming the next victim. Behind the scenes, he saw strange symbols carved into the wooden beams and heard whispers, as if the building itself spoke, promising him pain and suffering if he dared to change anything. Time was running out, and every hour brought him closer to the inevitable confrontation with the nightmare he had to overcome to save his family. When Michael finally broke through the masked figures, he found a dark room behind the stage. In the center of the room was an altar covered with candles, surrounded by items belonging to the people whose stories had been shown on stage. Children's toys, photographs, rings. Among them, Michael saw his daughter's drawing, the very one she had recently made at school. His heart sank in terror. He realized that his family was already part of this nightmare, and time was running out. Michael knew he had to destroy the altar to sever the connection between the theatre and reality. He grabbed one of the candles, and despite the flames burning his hands, he turned it over, setting fire to the cloths covering the altar. At that moment, the theatre's walls began to tremble, and a long moan echoed as if the building itself was in pain. The masked figures began to disappear, turning into clouds of smoke, and the whispering grew louder, turning into desperate screams. Michael ran onto the stage, shouting at the audience to leave the theatre immediately. Panic swept through the hall. People rushed to the exits, and the floor beneath them began to collapse, revealing yawning chasms into the unknown. Michael felt adrenaline surging through him, pushing him to move faster, despite the exhaustion and fear. When he finally made it outside, he looked back and saw the theatre sinking into darkness as if it had never existed. A final, piercing scream sounded, and the building vanished, leaving behind only emptiness and a faint smell of burning in the night air. Michael hugged his family tightly, knowing that this nightmare would not return, at least as long as he was there. The next morning, Michael awoke to the sound of a helicopter flying overhead, feeling slightly dizzy. The events of the previous night still seemed hazy, as if it had been a bad dream. Anna sat at the edge of the bed, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. She looked at Michael, and in her eyes he saw a glimmer of hope. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, gently touching his hand. Michael nodded, though he knew nothing was okay. He felt that the theatre was still haunting them, its shadow hiding in the deepest corners of their minds. When he stepped outside, the sunlight blinded him, but even in the bright rays, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He couldn't forget what he had seen in that room, the people's belongings, the symbols on the beams, the altar. Michael understood that the theatre was not just a cursed place, it was alive, feeding on fear and despair. And though the building was gone, Michael knew that the entity that controlled it still existed somewhere. Soon after, rumors began to spread in the city. People said they saw strange shadows gliding through the streets at night, that whispers came from nowhere, which couldn't just be the wind. Some claimed that posters for the Theatre of Nightmares had appeared in other parts of the city, but when people went there, they found nothing but empty walls and abandoned buildings. Michael knew he couldn't stay in this city. Too many memories, too many horrors. He and Anna decided that, for the safety of their children, they needed to leave and start fresh. But even as they packed their things and prepared to move, Michael felt that the theatre's shadow would follow them wherever they went. It wasn't just fear, it was a promise that the nightmare could return at any moment. As the family left the city, Michael looked back one last time, and it seemed to him that he saw a familiar figure in a mask in one of the alleys. He turned away, trying to focus on the future, but he knew that somewhere deep inside, the dark part of his mind was still waiting for the next performance, which would begin when he least expected it. The Theatre of Nightmares was destroyed, but its essence remained alive. It had become a part of Michael, and now his life had turned into an endless struggle with his own fears, a struggle he could not afford to lose. For his fate and the fate of his family depended on it. Give this video a like if you like this format, share it with your friends, and of course leave your thoughts in the comments. I love reading them.